Good morning, everybody. Good morgen, Bergen. Okay, we had a long night last night. So it is incredibly wonderful to be here. I'm going to start the timer. It's my second time in Bergen, and I have not yet been to Oslo, so I need to work on that. I know. So before I start, I'd like to say three things. One of them is obviously it's very humbling to be here. For a few years, I had the great privilege of being responsible for a lot of Lincoln Center's international consulting work. And as you might imagine, we get to travel all over the world. And I was lucky enough to go to Latin and South America, Asia, all parts of the world except for Europe. And I understand why. We are the annoying teenage version of arts and culture as it was created in communities around Europe for centuries. But something interesting is happening. In the past 6 months alone, I have been to Europe 3 times because there seems to be a conversation starting that I think is very exciting. People are no longer looking to us for programming or artistic ideas. They're looking to us for topics like governance and philanthropy. And how do we engage with the community in new and innovative ways? And one example is we were in Spain a few months ago because the Spanish government is putting into place a new law called the Law of Patronage. And they are building incentives for the private sector to support the arts. And my feeling is that over time, the government will start decreasing their support of the arts so that the private sector can come in. And cultural leaders are very cautiously optimistic because it's a wonderful opportunity, but they've never had that relationship with the private sector before, and we do. In fact, that's something that we do because we have to, out of necessity. And I'll explain a little bit of that later. The second thing I would like to do is honor the expertise and the joy in the room here today. I was fortunate enough to be here last night for the awards, and it was so heartwarming to see the amazing work that is happening. And so as I am here sharing with you, also know that you are sharing with me, and I am taking that back home. Something that I say to my team all the time is, we are in the business of giving joy to people, and we cannot give what we do not have. And so it is very impressive to me and very important to me that this room, the expertise and the joy in this room is something that I am taking with me as well, so thank you. And then the third thing I want to say before I start is that over the course of the next half hour and then into our conversation, I will be sharing concepts, I will be sharing strategies, and I will be sharing case studies. Some of you might attach to the concepts, some of you might attach to strategies, some of you might attach to programs and case studies. We do things very differently because we have to. So for example, our philanthropy world, less than 5% of our budget is given to us by the government. That's almost the opposite here. So we as a result have to behave very differently. There are people that look to us and say, we want to learn from you out of necessity. Some people say we want to learn from you out of desire to engage with the private sector. But philanthropy is something that requires us to behave very differently. And the other thing that we'll talk a little bit about is scalability. So we do a lot of things because we are 11 organizations all on one campus, and it can be overwhelming. And when I share case studies, the response tends to be, oh, well, you can do that because you're a Lincoln Center. How is that relevant to me? So, good morning. So as I share these case studies, the point is not to feel overwhelmed, or the point is not to feel like this can never happen here, because the concepts and the strategies are transferable, even if the end result is very different and very local. So with that in mind, I would now like to start the official presentation. Now, who here has heard of Lincoln Center? Okay, good. My job is now a little easier. Who has been to Lincoln Center? Oh, wonderful. Okay, good. So I'm going to kick off by showing a video that represents all the work that we do, and then I'll go into explaining how it is that we are structured. That is me.
The arts are not for the privileged few,
but for the many. Their place is not on the periphery of daily life, but at its center.
Lincoln Center was a bold idea, taking 16 acres on Manhattan's West Side and transforming them into a campus, not just for one art form, but for all the performing arts. The idea? The sum would be greater than its parts, and this center, Lincoln Center, would welcome the world.
Here will occur a true interchange of the fruits of national cultures.
60 years after President Eisenhower broke ground, Lincoln Center continues to embrace this vision. From all 5 boroughs, across continents, cultures, and communities, all are welcome at the world's leading performing arts center. Lincoln Center is the cultural heart of New York City. We are the home of artists. There are 11 resident arts organizations on our campus, all world-class names. The Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, Film Society of Lincoln Center, Jazz at Lincoln Center, the Juilliard School, Lincoln Center Theater, the Metropolitan Opera, New York City Ballet, New York Philharmonic, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, School of American Ballet, and Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. We've developed some of the most beloved and accessible arts festivals and series, including the Mostly Mozart Festival, the American Songbook Series, Lincoln Center Out of Doors, Midsummer Night's Swing, and more. With Live from Lincoln Center, our award-winning broadcast series, plus our investment in 21st century digital technology, we bring the magic of this campus to all corners of the globe, reaching hundreds of millions of people. Over the last decade, we have invested $1.2 billion to transform the campus. We welcome over 6.5 million visitors annually, and we provide hundreds of free performances and programs as we open our doors even wider for our New York community and beyond. Investing in our neighbors in all 5 boroughs is a Lincoln Center priority. The arts change all our lives for the better. We know this, and we act on it. This is perhaps our most important role. Through our education and community outreach programs, Lincoln Center extends well beyond its campus and has impacted the lives of over 20 million students, many of them encountering the performing arts for the first time. There is simply no other place on earth like Lincoln Center, and all of this has been made possible by the generosity and vision of millions of people who continue to believe in the power of the arts. Lincoln Center's donors, corporate sponsors, constituents, the community, and the greater city of New York have made this iconic institution a beacon of culture for all. How will Lincoln Center thrive for another 60 years? By continuing to follow Rockefeller's mandate that the arts remain at the center of our daily lives and be accessible to all. We are Lincoln Center, and we are your center for the performing arts.
Thank you for indulging that video first thing in the morning. So you'll notice that the video was, well, first of all, for those of you who have not been to Lincoln Center, now you need to come. And you are more than welcome. And for those of you that have been, I look forward to receiving you again. So the video was divided structurally in 3 main points, and those 3 points really articulate the 3 responsibilities that we have as Lincoln Center. Before I go into those 3 responsibilities, I want to outline the structure, because there are 11 organizations that share the physical space. Catherine, who you will meet shortly, and I work at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, and there are 10 other organizations that are world-class and renowned in and of themselves that share the space with us. We have a responsibility for telling the larger story and for taking care of the larger ecosystem, but there is no reporting structure. The Metropolitan Opera doesn't ask us what to produce or what to present. They do it on their own. So really the responsibilities of Lincoln Center for the Performing Art are 3, and those are the 3 chapters of that video I just showed you. The first one is campus stewardship. So we are responsible for the physical location, the 16 acres in New York City where all these institutions live. We take care of the space. We take care of economies of scale. The second responsibility we have is artistic. So we have 30 venues between all 11 organizations, and a lot of organizations and companies that only have 8 or 9 month seasons. So historically, Lincoln Center has had to begin programming to fill that calendar gap. So really, if you come to New York in the summer, most of the programming is us because our resident companies are not with us. So historically, we have had to fill the gap from a calendar perspective, but it means that we also have an opportunity to fill the gap from a content and a genre perspective. So over the summer, when we are responsible for programming, you will see a lot more public programming. You will see a lot more contemporary and popular programming because we understand that we are part of a larger ecosystem and we have a gap to fill. Between all of us, we program around 3,000 performances every year. So when I have family that comes to New York City and says, "What should I go see tonight?" I say, "I have no idea." Because on any given day, there are so many events. So I'm going to be talking really about Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts and our responsibility to the larger ecosystem. And then, so as I said, the first responsibility is campus stewardship, the second responsibility is artistic programming, and the third responsibility, which is my area of oversight, is social impact. And how do we create programs and initiatives that connect the institution to the larger city around us? This is my portfolio. So when I talk about the activities that I am responsible for, I talk about educational partnerships, I talk about community engagement programs, I talk about artistic programming for young people and audiences, with a particular focus on young audiences on the autism spectrum and with different abilities, and we can talk about that later. Professional development for artists and educators. And then finally, we have a cultural innovation grant program where we give money to cultural institutions that are small to mid-size in certain communities of New York City because we want to reward them for being so culturally responsive to the communities that surround them. So when I talk about, when I go into some of the details, know that this is my world within Lincoln Center, and that with the exception of this area right here, I'm not an artist, I'm not a programmer. So when people think of Lincoln Center, they think about the physical location, they think about the artistic programming. My goal for this morning is that by the time we leave, you have been reintroduced to what seems like a new institution. From a size perspective, we are roughly around 10% of Lincoln Center's budget. We have anywhere between 32 and 40 full-time staff members and over 100 part-time and seasonal. So really, we are almost like our own institution within an institution, within a series of institutions. It's confusing. And then this is something that I live by and that our teams live by. And if we are going to be leaders in this field, we live by this every day. And it's one of my favorite quotes, which is, "Leaders who don't listen will eventually be surrounded by people that have nothing to say." We strive for three things at Lincoln Center. We strive for relevance, we strive for impact, and we strive for access. So when I think about social impact and the programs that I have oversight over, I'm always thinking, how are we making Lincoln Center more relevant? How are we making Lincoln Center more impactful? And how are we making Lincoln Center more accessible? And this quote to me is a great way of getting there. So I'm going to jump into some work that we have been doing recently about rethinking what it means to be a cultural institution in New York City. And we start by reframing us philosophically into what does it mean to be committed to social impact as a cultural institution. I'm going to provide some language just so we have a common vocabulary about how we talk about this. There are 20 different definitions for social impact, but I want to share this one so that we have a common understanding. The arts provide a resource that people can use to make sense of the world as it is, to connect with collective memory, and to imagine the future. Neighborhoods with a vital cultural life also enjoy stronger community and civic engagement, better health, education, and personal security, and economic revitalization. And there's research that points to that. I'm not making that up. Our mission as a team is to understand these connections and the role that the arts and Lincoln Center can play in strengthening them. And why social impact? Social impact is the effect an organization has on the well-being of the communities of which it is a part and of which it seeks to be a part. Lincoln Center's commitment to using the arts to create significant positive social change is made evident through a deliberate set of activities and programs that attract and engage all audiences with a diverse array of artistic offerings for young people and families, educational partnerships, community engagement initiatives, and accessibility programs. Our portfolio of activities places Lincoln Center in dialogue with the world. The first thing that I want people to start thinking about is, historically, the question has always been for us, what is the impact of Lincoln Center on New York City? And I'm actually asking to reverse that question and saying, yes, that's important, but I actually think it's more important to ask the question, what is the impact of New York City on Lincoln Center? Have we ever been on the receiving end of that question? And are our cultural institutions usually on the receiving end of that question? It's a scary question to ask, but it's necessary if we are striving for relevance. So the way that I would like to break out the next few slides and the next few minutes is talking about how this is a process for us, and I invite you to follow similar processes if it's relevant, but this is how I make sense of the work that we have ahead of us. So first of all, we talk about the legacy of our history, which is complicated, it's exciting, it's controversial. We talk about the assets, because we are already doing good work. Everybody in this room is already doing amazing work. And we have peers in the nonprofit sector that are already doing good work. We learn so much from the library sector. Libraries in New York City and libraries across the world have already figured out how to become civic institutions. We need to follow their guidance. The opportunity, the world is changing and we need to adapt with it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The proposition, how do we seek to change? And then the impact, how do we tell a new kind of story? So this to me was the structure through which we started reimagining what we did. So the legacy, you heard in the video the statement read by children, the arts are not for the privileged few, but for the many. Their place is not on the periphery of daily life, but at its center. They should function not merely as another form of entertainment, but rather should contribute significantly to our well-being and happiness. That was said by our founding president. Now, if we break that up and study that, the arts are not for the privileged few, but for the many, we're really talking about access. When we talk about their place is not at the periphery of daily life, but at its center, we're talking about relevance. And when we talk about they should function not merely as another form of entertainment, but rather should contribute significantly to our well-being and happiness, we're talking about impact. So everything in my mind, even though this is a 60-year-old quote, goes back to relevance, access, and impact. Another quote that I love of his is, he says, to fully understand the opportunity we have, we must think through carefully the role of our artistic institutions and base our thinking not upon the assumption that a very small segment of the population responds to the arts, but rather to take the more positive view that our potential public is limitless if we are prepared to devote ourselves to its interests. So how do we go out into the world and build those relationships? So that leads us to the assets. So at Lincoln Center, we have 60 years, which is almost nothing in the bigger scheme of things. But we have things that we already do that can start being the pieces of the puzzle as we tell a new kind of story. So we have educational partnerships. We have community engagement programs. We have arts programming for youth and families. We have accessibility initiatives for people with different abilities, physical and cognitive. We have a commitment to veteran affairs, so those that have served in the military, cultural innovation grants. We are committed to research and evaluation, and we have a newfound commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I just read out is not terribly innovative, right? These are things that a lot of us in the room are already doing. What I am offering is to saying, how do we look at these programs through a new lens so that it's contributing to the institution in new ways? Actually, I'm going to skip through some of these. So this program, this is a case study now, where we hosted a festival exclusively for young audiences on the autism spectrum. So we said, how do we welcome new audiences, and how do we produce works of art, how do we produce experiences where we are welcoming a specific type of audience for the first time with intentionally and responsibly. So I'm going to share this video with you all.
The Big Umbrella Festival is world-class art that'll be made up of performances, workshops for individuals who are interested in doing this kind of work, opportunities for parents and artists to come together to talk about, if theater is for everyone, how do we make that accessible for people on the autism spectrum?
It's necessary, this work, because the work is like transformative. If a show's going well, if the performers are doing it right, there are going to be some kids who exhibit reactions which you won't see elsewhere. And I think it's great to see the kids in that wider context.
You know, you guys go, oh, that's good, that's awesome, that's great. And that makes him feel good about himself. I'm sure I can see that in him.
I mean, there hasn't been anything else I've found that's been like this. And trust me, I've been looking. So to see this and to be here, it's been pretty wonderful.
This festival is really a way of showing the validity and the necessity of this kind of work to a wider audience.
Our world is one of many different viewpoints and abilities, and to have work for all of those abilities is beautiful.
There are a lot of people like Patrick living in a world that's made for neurotypical people, and it's really great to have a place where they can be themselves.
So that was one of the most fabulous things I have ever been a part of. An interesting side note is, from a philanthropic standpoint, we thought the medical sector and the research sector would be very supportive of something like this, because in the United States it had never been done before. And what we found is, they said to us, if you can prove statistically that you are undiagnosing autism or curing autism, then we will give you the money. And we said we're only putting on a show for an hour. We're not. But what's interesting is that there was never a conversation about quality of life. There was never a conversation. Parents were telling us that they might not find a cure, if that is even something that is required in the world of autism, within the lifetime of their children. But living in New York City, they cannot participate with arts and culture, so where is the conversation around quality of life? So what we did during this festival is we hired a medical research firm to help change the story. So by the time this festival was over, we went back to those funders and donors, and we said, this is the story we want to tell, and it's not about undiagnosing, it's not about medically changing the path of these children, it's about providing families with quality of life experiences in New York City, which should revolve around arts and culture. So that's our way of trying to push the narrative in a different direction as well, which we think we have a responsibility towards. I'm going to speed through. I'm not going to talk much about these case studies because I want to get to more of the strategies. So the opportunity. The world is changing. Talking about civic engagement and social impact is not just the right thing to do. It is also increasingly necessary for those of us that need to engage with the private sector. So a few years ago, I worked on a program, on a research study called Culture Track out of an agency called LaPlaca Cohen, where I was working. And it was fascinating. So Culture Track, I encourage you all to download it. It's the longest longitudinal study of cultural consumption in the United States. It talks about behaviors and trends of cultural participation, but it also talks about philanthropy and individual donorship. So what's interesting is that it says a growing number of audiences are consuming culture that don't require donations. However, audiences are giving consistently to organizations that produce and present the arts. In fact, there's a misconception in the United States that people are giving less and less philanthropically. That's not true. The numbers are going up, even though the amounts are smaller and smaller. And when asked, the top reasons for donating to arts and culture is actually social impact. And this, I think, is interesting, certainly to us in the United States, but I think it's an evolving trend we are starting to see across the world, is that when people give to arts and culture, they give because they either believe in the mission, they believe in the impact on the community, or they believe in the impact of the world. Very few want to support artists, and very few are even worried about our funding. They don't care. What are we doing for the world? If we can tell that story, we are inviting people in. Audiences prefer to give to organizations that believe have greater impact, but arts and culture have never really kept up with that game. Sectors like healthcare, sectors like education, humanitarian crises, they're very good at engaging philanthropically, but the arts are not. So reasons for not donating to culture is because other causes have greater impact, which we need to get better at telling that story, or because it's not personally important to me. So how do we tap into that? So as I said, healthcare, education, humanitarian relief, those are causes that are starting to tell stories in a way that we need to get better at. So this is the philanthropic, this is how people give. Look at where arts and culture is on the bottom. But then if you look at the programs that I just shared with you, those in red are actually peripherally involved in programs that I'm responsible for. So why go after this money or this attention or this engagement when I can start telling many different stories in which the arts play a pivotal role? And now we start having a bigger conversation, a more intentional conversation with a bigger audience. So with social impact as the main driver, cultural organizations need to work harder to measure and articulate their distinct impact and prove how they are essential to people's lives and livelihoods. And this is what it says: we don't need to reinvent the wheel. All we need to do is establish a dialogue-based relationship with our audiences. We need to focus on results and impact. We need to look beyond the field for effective models, which is why I keep on going to things like libraries and education, and understand generational differences, which Catherine will talk about later. And despite what most people think, Lincoln Center is already engaging in dialogue-based, impact-driven activities, mostly through the work of education and community engagement. In fact, not only is that so relevant, that portfolio which I shared with you has grown 300% in size in the past 7 years. On the one hand, because we're doing something that's meaningful, but on the other hand, because the world is supporting it more and more. This is something that I want to leave you with and that you should download. It's Americans for the Arts created this amazing research study that talks about all the different intersections of arts and culture, with the environment, with the economy, with infrastructure, with innovation, education, social justice, diplomacy, cultural and heritage, health and wellness, faith. If you Google them, Americans for the Arts Social Impact, and this is an interactive feature on their website, and it's fabulous. So the proposition for us, if you think about the history of Lincoln Center, in 1975, we had Lincoln Center, you saw the videos of them building it, and we had Lincoln Center Institute, which was their education department, which was started in 1975. By 2018, we have Lincoln Center and the education department at Lincoln Center, which had been rebranded as Lincoln Center Education, and then we have all these pieces of the puzzle which live within Lincoln Center, or that live within our institution, but don't really tell a cohesive story. So we have education, community engagement, we have programming for young people, we have diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have accessibility. It's very disjointed. So when I think about who we need to become, this is what an institution like Lincoln Center looks like to me. And now we start looking at some of the way that the video is organized. We have a commitment to artistic programming, we have a commitment to campus stewardship, and we have a commitment to social impact. I will never forget one of the things that we had a director of press, and she would tell me, "Alex, you exhaust me, because you have so many amazing stories at the ground level, but they never feed their way up to the top. How is the story of veteran affairs connected to Lincoln Center?" So this architecture allows us to tell stories that feed to Lincoln Center that is committed to social impact. And in fact, we have an archivist at Lincoln Center, and I worked with her and I said, what would happen if we looked at the history of Lincoln Center, not through the lens of artistic programming, but through the lens of social impact? What would we find? And so there is things like, in 1963, Lincoln Center started opening its rehearsals to people with disabilities. Who knew? Lincoln Center created the profession of teaching artistry by hiring Juilliard students to go into schools. Teaching artistry right now is an international profession. We started hosting community holiday festivals with arts organizations from across New York City. I'm going to speed through these. Lincoln Center creates the Age in Action Festival, celebrating the skills and talents of senior citizens. Lincoln Center becomes a voter registration site in order to respond to the voter turnout in New York City. Lincoln Center creates the Department of Programs and Services with people with disabilities in advance of any federal law about accessibility into physical spaces. So we were ahead of the curve. So fast forward right? 60 years. And in 2019, we hosted our very first inaugural Social Impact Gala to tell the story of Lincoln Center through social impact lens and to pave the way for the next 60 years. By the way, having a gala around social impact exceeded our fundraising goals because people care about that cause and we're very invested. So the impact, really quickly, the danger in this is, well, we want to be all things to all people. Social impact is to everybody. Social impact is about us going out. Yes, but there's a danger in thinking that we can be all things to all people. So there are three paradigm shifts, or three paradigms that I invite my team to think about all the time. Are your programs, the goal is to have local impact or to have a global reputation? People confuse all the time these two things. Local impact needs to be local or even hyper-local. But if you have a global reputation, you need to be very mindful. You don't, in my opinion, you don't get to this without first achieving that. So, and Lincoln Center being a very global name, we need to be mindful. The other thing we talk about all the time is, are you a high-touch, low-volume program, or are you a low-touch, high-volume program? Where do you live? Where do our programs live on this spectrum? Knowing that this is a spectrum, we have a lot of different places. So when we think about a portfolio approach to social impact, we need programs that live on this spectrum and that are doing all these things. And finally, we think about, is this a program that offers direct service or is this a program that offers a network service? So are we going into the communities and offering programs directly, or are we supporting those that do, whether it's through grants, financing, or professional development? So this is what it looks like today. So for those of you that can see it, this is a map of New York City and the 5 boroughs. You may not know that Lincoln Center is also divided into 51 districts. So that pin is where Lincoln Center is. If you were to imagine where audience or ticket buyers come from, they come fairly close to that pin. But when I drop a pin on every district in which my activities have a presence, this is what Lincoln Center looks like. So Lincoln Center, as of last month, has relationships with each and every one of New York City's 51 districts because we are going out into New York City and we are asking them, how can we be your performing arts center and what will it take for you to come to us? So that is all my presentation. I will be back in half an hour to have a conversation, but I want to thank you very much for listening and for your time, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.